Today, November 3rd, is just one day past All Hallow Tide, which is actually a triduum, meaning 3 days of commemoration that includes All Hallows Eve, which we now know as Halloween, All Saints or All Hallows Day, which is November 1st, and All Souls Day, November 2nd. Why this time of the year? I touched on that a bit before. It's the time that is situated at harvest time, right in the middle between autumnal equinox in September and winter solstice in December. The cosmic cycles, our religious beliefs, and our cultural understandings become intertwined at a time that marks the end of the harvest, the now noticeable longer nights, cooler temperatures, the anticipation of winter, a time of dormancy and death in nature. In many cultural traditions, it is perceived as a time where the veil between this life and the next, between the living and the dead, between flesh and spirit, is at its thinnest. It's a reminder of the cyclical nature of death and rebirth. It's a time to reflect on how we wish to be remembered and also how to remember and honor our deceased loved ones. It's a time where we might be confronted by our fears of what happens when we die, the promised afterlife or nothingness, and everything else in between. It's a time to guard against spiritual darkness, light candles, ward off evil so the good can win, and attempt to overcome ignorance by shedding light, as we just witnessed in the Diwali celebration this last week. We can find examples throughout the world of celebrations that dissolve the boundaries of the ordinary world. For instance, in Korea, Chuseok takes place in late September or early October, and involves preparing and offering food to ancestors. Gai Jatra, or Cow Festival, in Nepal occurs in August and September. It honors deceased family members and celebrates their journey to the afterlife with processions and festivities. In the Celtic tradition, Samhain, summer's end, takes place from October 31st to November 1st. The Triduum. It marks the end of the harvest and the beginning of the darker half of the year. The Celts believed the veil between the living and the dead was especially thin at this time, which allowed for visiting between the two worlds. These spirits, evil spirits, could come out of hiding as summer turned into fall, which for the Celts signaled the beginning of winter and an association with death. They dressed in costumes, hoping the evil spirits wouldn't recognize them. And guising, as it is called, is found in many traditions around the world. In an effort to appease the evil spirits, they gave treats or soul cakes to children at the door to eat on behalf of the departed. We know it now as trick or treat. They built bonfires to light the dark nights to frighten spirits away. Think of our jack-o'-lanterns. When thousands of Celts became Christians during the 6th and 7th centuries, the Church, Catholic Church, of course, at the time, made the decision to try to incorporate the celebration of Samhain to All Hallows Day, All Souls Day, Saints Day, rather than extinguish it. Imagine that. Instead, Halloween has become a very unique celebration that's simultaneously secular, spiritual, and supernatural. Fast forward 1,000 years to October 31st, 1517. Ring a bell? That date? A priest by the name of Martin Luther went to the door of the Church of All Saints in Wittenberg, Germany, and nailed to the door a document in which he questioned 95 things about the church. A coincidence? An attempt to overcome ignorance by shedding light? showing hospitality to the souls of the dead who are believed to return home on one night of the year, is found in many cultures, including in Dia de los Muertos, which is celebrated in Mexico and parts of Central America from October 31st to November 2nd. It honors the dead with altars, offerings, and festive activities. It combines indigenous traditions with Catholic elements. Have you ever wondered why the skeleton features large during Halloween? The grinning, dancing skeleton, a Halloween staple, is an image that comes to us directly from medieval Europe when the continent was overrun by the bubonic plague, a deadly pandemic that reduced the population by at least 1/3 and imposed inescapable daily reminders of the imminence of death and the fleeting nature of our mortal concerns. Halloween and similar celebrations, skeletons, skulls, and artwork depicting death are all reminders of our own mortality. They are often intended to give us some sense of mastery over our fears about death and dying. Maria Popova is a Bulgarian-born, American-based essayist, poet, and writer of literary and arts commentary and cultural criticism. She wrote in her blog in January 2022, and I'm quoting, "When my atheist engineer grandfather died, my atheist engineer grandmother leaned over the body in the hospice bed that had contained half a century of shared life and love, cradled the cranium in which his stubborn and sensitive mind had dwelled, and whispered, 'Where did you go, my darling?'" End of quote. To her and me, this moment suggests that when the moment of material undoing arrives, our beliefs and our minds simply cannot fathom how something as exquisite as the universe of thought and feeling inside of us can vanish into seeming nothingness. Animated by electrical impulses and temporal interactions of matter, our finite minds simply cannot grasp a timeless and infinite void beyond being. Our brain is challenged when faced with the absence of what used to be here with us in the moment and emotionally close to us. As the neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor states in her research on the grieving brain, our brain's virtual map of here, now, and close does not readily compute the implications of the death of a loved one. We now have scientific evidence of what we have understood for thousands of years. We need time and many new experiences to grapple with and adjust to the loss of someone we love. And most of us cannot easily wrap our head around our own experience of dying and what lies beyond. While death and the afterlife form central themes in major world religions, each religion offers its unique perspective on death and what happens afterwards. In the Christian tradition, the Old Testament, as we heard in our reading of Ecclesiastes, focuses on death as an inevitable part of human life, linked to the fall and human sin. Death is treated with reverence and fear, but also with an understanding of God's ultimate control over life and death. We hear of the mystery of Sheol, the place where the dead go. It is a shadowy, ambiguous realm, sometimes depicted as a place of darkness and silence, where both the righteous and the wicked go. However, the Old Testament also offers us occasional glimpses of hope through resurrection. By contrast, in the New Testament, death is transformed by the person and work of Jesus Christ. It emphasizes the defeat of death through Jesus, resurrection, and eternal life, just as we heard in the verses from John. The hope and promise of life after death is central to the New Testament. Christian mystics often use metaphors of death and transformation to describe the soul's journey toward union with God. Death is viewed not as an end, but as a necessary process of spiritual purification and rebirth. They present death as a profound transition that brings the soul closer to divine presence and eternal life. The mystical writings reflect a belief in the ultimate victory over death through a spiritual transformation and union with God. And while this rings true for many believers, it's not easily lived out in this very physical world. If I understand Mennonite theology correctly, and I'm open to hearing other views on it, the Mennonite approach to death is grounded in faith in God, simplicity, community support, forgiveness, and a peaceful acceptance of God's will. This focus on spiritual readiness, rather than elaborate rituals, reflects a commitment to living a life that honors God's teachings. I am wondering, though, how we arrive at this spiritual readiness when we avoid tender yet challenging and meaningful conversations about our deeply rooted doubts and fears. And what about those who do not grow up with a spiritual framework that can provide some guidance? Irvin Yalom, in his memoir, A Matter of Death and Life, which he wrote at age 90, ends his book with a letter to his wife 125 days after her death. Yalom, a renowned psychiatrist and professor emeritus at Stanford University, and a self-confessed ardent materialist, writes that he wished he could be buried side by side in the same coffin with her, his wife, which he calls an entirely fantastical thought. He goes on to say, and I'm quoting, "Of course, this is unreal. Of course, I can never join you. You and I will no longer exist. It's a fairy tale. Since I was 13, I've never taken seriously any religious or spiritual view of an afterlife. And yet the fact that I, a devout skeptic and scientist, am nonetheless soothed by the thought of joining my dead wife is evidence of the extraordinarily powerful desire we have for persistence and the dread we humans have of oblivion. I am left with renewed respect for the power and the soothing of magical thinking." End of quote. This story and the earlier one reflect the thoughts, fears, and feelings shared in the 150 or so death cafes I have been hosting over the last 9 years. Stories about the fear or promise of death, of entering the afterlife or the fear of nothingness, and of being forgotten, and so much more. An often implied question is whether these soothing or magical beliefs are really magical, or if they become real and true after we take a leap of faith. Here in Canada and in many countries around the world, even the noun death and the adjective dead are often dreaded and thus avoided. We use euphemisms such as passed away, gone from us, left us, gone to sleep, and so on and so on. It is as if using the D word, as some people refer to it, and even more importantly, having a conversation about death and dying, were to open the door for the grim reaper inviting him in instantaneously. And yet, some of the world's most famous architecture, our most beloved wonders, are graves. The pyramids of Egypt, India's Taj Mahal are, after all monuments built to house the dead. And even though we know we are not eternal, we often live as if we were. We lack a healthy and humble relationship to our mortality. Centuries ago, the social approach was very different. People were aware of the Latin phrase that now has become a popular meme, memento mori, which literally means, remember, you must die. All spiritual traditions remind us of the preciousness of life that we can only appreciate when confronting openly and honestly our fragility in life, which in turn helps us reevaluate our own governing values. Until the 20th century, remembering one's own death was not something negative, but rather an encouragement to lead a virtuous, good, and meaningful life. Many works of art placed in churches, for example, also recall the theme of death to induce viewers to meditate on the meaning of life. Ever since cameras were invented in 1839, photography has kept company with death, wrote Susan Sontag. We currently live in a strangely paradoxical world where we are captivated by death. It is in our news, our novels, our video games. It's in the minutiae of the true crime podcasts, crime shows, and murder mysteries that proliferate TV, streaming devices, and the internet. It is in our nursery rhymes, our museums, and movies. We hear about planes crashing, train disasters, war, mass graves, people swept away in tsunamis, floods, or mudslides, men in trucks mowing down pedestrians. But it is all very difficult to apprehend and remain somewhat abstract for us, often leaving us numb and apathetic. We have become a death-phobic society, though, when it comes to our personal wrestling with aging, old age, and death. Due to AI, we now can even resurrect our dead loved ones with the help of videos, text messages, and writings of our loved ones, and have a conversation with this AI person as if it were the person that has gone from our lives. However, most of the time, our attempts at distraction and avoidance tend to plunge us into a loop of apprehension and push us to pursue unattainable goals. At the same time, right across the globe, though, we have been experiencing a hunger to develop a different relationship with our understanding of death, it seems. Why else would death cafes, now in their 13th year, have spread from an East London basement to over 85 countries in the world and be facilitated in over 60 different languages, amounting by now to over approximately 20,000 death cafes that have been held worldwide and happen every day of the year. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Denial of Death, which Ernest Becker wrote just a little over 50 years ago, he states that only by confronting our own mortality can we live more fully. To hold that terror, he says, is to see more clearly what matters and what does not, and how important it is to grasp the difference. Contemplating death is like a cold plunge for the soul, he goes on to say, a prick to the amygdala, our fear center. We emerge renewed with our vision clarified. Based on my experience working with dozens upon dozens of hospice residents and their families, my interactions with my spiritual direction companions, and by hosting death cafes, I have come to the following conclusion. We're desperate to find frameworks that guide us in our journey through life and death, in a way that holds meaning, purpose, and hope for us. And we need this framework to be shared with others in a communal setting. Across major world religions, so-called manuals exist on living with the end in mind. The central concerns of manuals and texts focused on living and dying revolves around ethical behavior, spiritual discipline, and preparation for the afterlife or spiritual liberation. The first Christian manual, the Ars Moriendi, the Art of Dying, did not come about till the 15th century as a response to the plague. A few other works have been published in the last 2 centuries, but nothing in the Christian tradition compares to the importance of definitive works, such as the Tibetan Book of the Dead, the Bardo Thodol, for instance, that is seminal in Buddhism. We often search for guidance in literature, which has wrestled with death in countless ways. One of the most famous examples in Western literature is The Death of Ivan Ilyich, written by Lev Tolstoy in 1886. The story revolves around Ivan Ilyich, a successful bureaucrat who confronts the meaningless and emptiness of his life when he becomes terminally ill. Through his suffering and reflections, Tolstoy critiques superficial values and highlights the importance of authenticity and spiritual awakening when facing death. The novella offers a profound meditation on how one should live and die with integrity and awareness rather than denying death, raging against it, or living in fear of it. During the last decade, more than a dozen books have been published in the English language that are classified as non-religious manuals on the subject. They often focus on philosophical reflections, psychological coping mechanisms, practical advice for end-of-life care, and ways to achieve a meaningful death. These contemplations nudge and prompt us to adjust our priorities so we live life fully and intentionally now. As you heard earlier, one of my favorite books on the end-of-life subject is the one that Carrie quoted from, a book written by a palliative care doctor, Dr. Rachel Clark from England. She is still practicing. She's half-time palliative care doc in a hospice that is in a larger hospital in England, and the other half of her life she is now devoting to writing. So in this book, she emphasizes, and I just want to reread a couple of those sentences that you heard earlier, no matter how beautiful, no matter how loved, nothing stands still, nothing endures. Impermanence is our only constant. But against these stark absolutes of lived experience stands something both elastic and enduring, our defining human capacity of choice, our power, one that nothing and no one can take from us, to decide for ourselves how to respond to this fate of being mortal. We have entered this liminal time when the veil between this life and the next is thinning. These days of growing hush and shortened days of autumn remind us that our own days are short and our own lives fleeting. Along with the crisp air, we are watching the creatures busy themselves for hibernation. Trees are becoming denuded, their dead leaves drop, the gardens are harvested, the earth has been turned and lies fallow. We are startled by the first chilly days, as though we had forgotten through the long hot summer that we still need warmth in our lives and will reach for it where we trust it may be found. We have entered the time of waiting for the hope and the promise that Advent and the birth of Jesus offer to us in the darkness of winter.